Muy buenas tardes, bienvenidas y bienvenidos a esta nueva actividad de Puerto Ideas Valparaíso 2021, que se realiza con el apoyo de Colbún, Copeuch y el Ministerio de las Culturas, las Artes y el Patrimonio. Mi nombre es Arturo Fonten, soy escritor, soy novelista, enseño filosofía en la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez y en la Universidad de Chile. Les invito a esta conversación con Ece Temelkuran, novelista, poeta y periodista turca de renombre mundial. Ece ha publicado novelas de gran resonancia. He leído una de ellas en inglés, ¿sí? The Time of Mute Swans. Es una novela de trasfondo político, el golpe militar turco de 1980. Es una novela política, pero es una novela muy emocional y hay una imagen que se me grabó por su belleza. Una bandada de cisnes mudos han volado por primera vez desde Rusia y se han quedado en una laguna en Ankara, en Turquía. Y los militares lo ven como un buen augurio y quieren romperles las alas para que se queden en Turquía, las aves, los cisnes, y no continúen su vuelo migratorio. Y unos niños quieren salvarlos para que puedan volar. El libro que nos ocupa hoy es distinto, es un ensayo apasionante que se lee muy rápido, que recomiendo y que tiene un nombre tremendo. Se llama ¿Cómo perder un país? 7 pasos de la democracia a la dictadura. Está editado por Anagrama. En él, Ece Temelkuran describe el fenómeno del movimiento populista de derecha que llevó a Erdogan a ganar las elecciones y a adueñarse del poder de la democracia hasta construir desde ella una autocracia, una verdadera dictadura con un disfraz legal. Erdogan fue elegido presidente por voto popular el año 2014. En ese momento Turquía era lo que llamamos un semipresidencialismo, el pueblo eligió directamente al presidente, pero a partir de ese momento fue modificando este régimen semipresidencial hasta transformarlo en la autocracia que es hoy, en la cual él concentra todos los poderes y, por ejemplo, él puede disolver el parlamento, etc. De tal manera que se ha transformado en una dictadura, de ahí el nombre del libro, desde la democracia a la dictadura, por la vía del voto, ¿no? Porque ella explica en el libro eso, cómo el voto se ha mantenido, pero en el resto el régimen es una dictadura. Pero lo apasionante del libro, de hecho, es que narra las experiencias del populismo, ¿no? La experiencia real, directa, su modo de operar, sus características, qué tipo de personas interpreta, por qué adquiere esta fuerza. El libro muestra que lo que pasó en Turquía ha pasado en otros países. Se trata de una ola populista que tiene resonancias en todas partes. De manera que el libro vale para Turquía, pero vale para muchísimas otras naciones. Es un fenómeno de nuestro tiempo el que este libro aborda. Así que sin más presentación, los invito a esta conversación con Ece Temelkuran. Ece, it's great to have you here. Welcome.
It's my pleasure, Arturo. Thank you. And thank you for the amazing introduction. I kind of quote words here and there. Thank you.
Well, the populist wave that overtook Turkey resonates, as I was saying, in many countries, certainly in Hungary, in Poland, in Russia, where an autocracy was established, winning elections and destroying the freedom of democracy from within, but keeping a kind of legal facade. In several countries, populism is at least a real threat to democracy. Your book gives a very vivid description, I think, of the phenomenon of right-wing populism in Turkey. You say it is a new we, for example, a movement that comes from the provinces and speaks for real people, a movement that is a kind of struggle for a new Turkey with dignity, quotes. Leaders that speak from a higher moral plane, a movement full of energy coming from, you say, manufactured victimhood and the politics of identity. Why don't you tell us more about the phenomenon of right-wing populism in Turkey?
Right-wing populism in Turkey has not been a new phenomenon. It has not been a new phenomenon. I think globally we have been experiencing the first signs of it, at least since 1980s, since the end of 1970s, actually. And what I wanted to do with this book was to tell that what we had been through in Turkey will be happening in the so-called most mature democracies, such as United States and England, you know, besides Poland, Russia, and Hungary and the others. I do think that, you know, it looks maddening, confusing from outside, but when you look deep into it, right-wing populism especially has been inherent in the system. And it is the fruit of the big crisis of capitalism, big crisis of representative democracy today. So in Turkey, of course, it happened in the most dramatic way. So it is easy to see it with naked eye. And funnily enough, people, intellectuals all around the world, especially Western democracies, was praising Mr. Erdogan, our current president, for being the exemplary leader, especially for Middle Eastern countries and for countries who have the you know, majority Muslim population. So actually the Western countries, the opinion makers, policy makers did not really see what was hitting Turkey. And when they saw it, it was already too late. It was an authoritarian regime. You know, he has been in power since 2002, and then now everything went really, really horrible, visibly horrible after, especially after 2013 Gezi uprising. But when they decided that this is a regime with authoritarian inclinations and intentions, they started making, you know, the international media, international intellectual circles, they started making it into, oh, suddenly things went really horrible because Turkey was a crazy country anyway. So this was supposed to happen. And it's also a Muslim country. So it is natural that these things happen. What I wanted to show the readers all around the world that this is not something, a political phenomenon that is specific to Turkey. It is just that Turkey, together with Russia, Hungary, and Poland, we are ahead of the curve, which actually will be experienced by other countries as well. The book was published in several countries, in Spanish, Italian. When I spoke about this book, about right-wing populism, people were really understanding what I was talking about because they were already experiencing this. But when it was published in English in 2019, British people or Americans, they were still thinking that this will not happen to them. So I talked a lot, but what I wanted to say is the book is, yes, it comes through Turkey, it comes from Turkey, but actually it's not about Turkey. It is about right-wing populism and the global patterns of right-wing populism, and that it's going to hit all of us. And it is a political tool, right-wing populism. I mean, it is not an ideology per se. It's a political tool. It is today very well used by right-wing politicians, obviously, but it's a political tool. And my definition of it is mobilizing the organized ignorance towards making them do choices that are against their interest. So it is mostly about organized and mobilized ignorance, if you ask me. Why is it happening is a longer story, but this is what is happening, I think.
Well, it's very telling what you explain. You claim that populism is extremely difficult to understand by those who want to attack it. And probably that's one of the problems. You say for those who are in big politics, you're right, the ordinary man's feeling of smallness and the rage it engenders are inaccessible. And so it is equally hard for them, for the people who want to attack populism, to comprehend how that smallness might desperately crave to be part of a we that promises greatness. The populist leader says to the people, you could say, it's not you, it's they, the elite, that prevents you from being great. This is, you say, what Trump's message meant, but it's a typical, in your view, it's a typical move of populist leaders. Why don't you explain a bit this point, which I found very, very interesting?
Yeah, this is the politics of emotions part of the story, I think. And it is more important than we'd like to think. Several people who are listening to us, who are writing in newspapers, who are writing for magazines, we have a understanding of humankind. We have an understanding of individual. I think this understanding has become too detached from the understanding of the ordinary man. And this gap is filled by right-wing populists at this point. You have been through 1980s, so you would know what I mean. 1980s was not only neoliberalism taking over the world by violence and by brutality, but it was also imposing its own understanding of society, its own understanding of art, culture, and zeitgeist. I mean, it changed the zeitgeist. And while doing that, I think it broke the last ties between the intellectual world and the ordinary man. So today, when right-wing populists or their spin doctors say something like elites, they actually are not completely wrong. There are some elites. There are, privileged people. There are intellectuals who are completely detached from the society and so on. So they do not know what the smallness, the feeling of smallness can do to a person, how desperate as ordinary man is when it comes to being heard. So I think there are two concepts which sound very similar to each other, but they're completely different from each other. And we, the privileged, in terms of culturally privileged, we can make our voices heard and so on. We are talking about dignity, and the progressive politics of the world is talking about dignity. Whereas the ones who are left behind, as they call themselves, the real people, the ordinary man, the small man who aspires for greatness, they are talking about pride. And right-wing populist leaders, starting from Erdogan, but including all of them, they always talk about pride rather than dignity. And they are promising these people who feel left out to mend their pride. So pride and dignity are two completely different things. Because pride calls for violence. Pride calls for power, hierarchy, oppression, domination, and so on. So they are promising these small men who are thriving for greatness to mend their pride by making us, the so-called privileged, the elite, by making us kneel in front of them. I think there is a bit of cultural war in this. There's a bit of politics of emotions in it. But this is the new world. This is a post-truth world where politics are not run on facts or truths or ideologies, well, ideologies, yes, but anyway, that's a long story. Truths and facts do not matter anymore. We are living in a world where facts do not convince anybody, and the truth is too scattered. So, in this gap of ideas, intellectual thinking, or cerebral politics, there is a lot of politics of emotions, which is performed excellently by these leaders. They are one of them. At least they make themselves, they present themselves as one of them. And when that association with the small man is complete, when Trump, Erdogan, Putin, or whoever complete that association with the small person, then on, I mean, like anything is possible for them. Anything is possible. They can lie, they can do horrible things, they can be ruthless, they can be completely evil. But that identification, that association with the small man makes them limitless politically, morally as well. So that smallness and that need of greatness, I think, cannot be really understood by columnists of New York Times or me. I am trying to understand it, but I cannot be that. I cannot completely empathize with that. So all these political elaborations, analysis are done by those people who do not know the feeling of smallness. And that is something about human psychology that has been discussed by Eric Fromm to everyone in political philosophy, but still we cannot cure this dark spot, so to speak, in human mind, and that dark spot can lead to, you know, horrifying consequences when it is manipulated by right-wing populist leaders, as the case is today.
So part of the elite that you describe is the media, no? The people who are on TV, and it also has to do here. There's also a role for social networks here. You talk about that there is an ostentatious offensiveness, which has to do with this pride you were talking about, which is actually, this offensiveness is actually a requirement to establish a direct communication between the leader and the masses. Now, why does this work with TV viewers? Why do they accept this offensiveness? And what is the role of mockery in the social network? Why mockery is such a weapon in social networks?
Well, something happened in journalism. I wouldn't say media. I wouldn't call it media, because we didn't actually call it media once. We started calling it media in 1990s. We called it press and journalism, but something happened there. Today, several news channels, news outlets are constantly obsessed with the idea of objectivity. Mm-hmm. Whereas actually they're talking about neutrality. And when there is a power relation that you have to talk about, and if you're neutral, you are naturally standing on the side of the powerful. This wasn't the case before 1980s. We had a political stance. We had, as journalists and as press in general, we had a political stance. We had a moral stance. So journalism by nature was oppositional, was controversial.
Of course.
And then, you know, with the power balance changing in the world, economy, you know, running the politics, especially after 1980s, it became so that journalism had to be neutral. so that this neoliberal ideal should not be shaken. I was a young journalist when all these things happened, and I, saw it happening in the newspaper office. A new sort of journalist sort of materialized. This journalist of finance journalism and so on, and suddenly the finance journalism became the main thing, whereas the news about labor, the news about poverty were categorized under the humanities, about under the human interest stories. So the economy was financed, and this labor and poverty had nothing to do with it. I think this was the consequence of the political change, political domination of capitalism. And then, of course, this was not completely invisible to the reader. I mean, like, they knew that this was happening. They didn't know it in these terms, maybe, but by time, media, even as buildings, actually, they moved from city centers to outside the cities. They were suddenly these companies, big companies. So actually, we estranged ourselves due to the conditions of new life. We estranged ourselves from the public, from the ordinary men, and so on. When I became a journalist, I was 19. Now I'm 48. I was 19, and the year was 1992. I remember that journalists were vagabonds. I mean, like, they weren't, these, they didn't look like corporate personalities. Now they do. So I think this is the reason why it is so easy for right-wing populist leaders to target the journalists now. Because we don't have anyone. We don't have the support that we had once, I think.
And what about the mockery in social networks, which you talk about that?
There is this is the first time we are experiencing this, because this is the first time we invented this medium, and it is so interesting because this time we are changing the entire setup of the communication system. There was, all these years, all these centuries, there was a stage, there was a microphone or a megaphone, whatever, somebody was shouting, there was the audience. And now there's no audience, there's no speaker, there's no power of the word anymore. So we are trying to deal with this. And while we are doing it, our politics is shaping in that communication sphere. And while doing that, we went into this cynicism and sarcastic flow, I think. And sarcasm, especially when it's made to make mockery of the political figures, creates the illusion of political action. And then, we do it more, and then we feel like we are doing something against the oppressive power. Whereas when it doesn't work, this mockery doesn't work, and when we feel defeated, that mockery, that sarcasm, that cynicism turns onto ourselves, and it becomes like a defeatist reaction to our situation, which looks like a village that is under siege in a castle. So we are blaming each other, and this defeat, the idea, the feeling of the defeat, I think creates this intellectual famine. So we kind of kill each other with our bitter jokes. And this is one of the political mistakes that people do when a country is faced by right-wing populism.
Now, your analysis is focused mainly on right-wing populism. However, left-wing populists share many traits with left-wing populists. One of them is what you call the infantilization of the people, I mean, people are treated like children in a sense, or transformed into children. You were in Venezuela, and you write that Chavez was infantilizing a nation and rendering basic human intelligence a crime against the proceso, you say, the overall transformation of the country, the so-called socialism, or a version of it tailored by Chavez himself, you say. Could you explain to us what is this process of infantilization that populism in general entails, and why does it work?
Yeah, my heart goes to Venezuela. I was there when everything was happening. So it is always heartbreaking when it happens in a Latin American country. I was there and I saw how it happened. It was thanks to all the labor of decades of political activists, decades of political work by activists, by politicians, by people in general. And there was a consent there. It wasn't that, suddenly a man showed up and then he, as a hero, he rescued the entire nation. There was a consent coming from a big part of the population, and they believed in something. So it was heartbreaking to hear this ambassador. He was an ambassador to Turkey. Then few years after Proceso, actually, right, literally like probably 1 or 2 years even after the Proceso, there was the ambassador, Venezuelan ambassador in Ankara, and we were giving a speech, and he suddenly retold the story in a completely different way. It was like, there's, and then one day Chavez went to that hill, and on top of that hill, there was a fig tree or some tree. And then he met his friends there, and he put his hand on the Bible with his friends. And then, this fairy tale that has nothing to do with politics, that has nothing to do with reality, and that had nothing to do with the truth. So I thought, okay, now they are using the infantilization method of, authoritarian leaders as well. I don't know, Arturo, maybe people enjoy this. Maybe the majority of society, not majority, but part of the society, they enjoy this infantilization because it makes everything simpler. It makes easier to memorize the narrative. So they can, these infantilizing politics can reproduce the minions in massive numbers, on industrial scale. So yeah, this is a political tool, infantilization, and it is one of the most disappointing bits about humankind. We are creatures that want to take refuge in fairy tales, and this does not change when it comes to most important political decisions. I don't know how to solve this problem, and those who came before me couldn't solve it either. I don't know if there is an ultimate cure for this, but this is one of the most important aspects of right-wing populism, for sure.
This is connected with the difficulty of so to speak, opposing populism, which you describe in very eloquent pages. You claim that the populist typically contradicts himself. He may be, say, proudly inconsistent. They deny facts. They use ad hominem arguments to cancel the opponent's legitimacy to argue, etc., etc. We all know these sorts of arguments, and you even have a few pages in which you analyze the different ways in which these arguments are used, or using classical logical terms, to describe these fallacies, which are known since antiquity, but you show how they work all together, somehow. But in other words, what you're saying is they do not argue in good faith. And you quote from Camus, who said, "A man with whom one cannot reason is a man to be feared." Now, do you think really one cannot reason with populists?
I have answered this question, or a question that is similar to this, for several times. Although I have most eloquent answers, I don't have the ultimate answer. I am thinking about lately, I'm thinking about radical love. How can we talk about radical love in politics? Because at some point we will have to reconcile this extreme polarization in societies. It just damaged the fabric of the society. I'm not even sure we can talk about society anymore. And then it's not only big political decisions like Brexit or Trump or elections or whatever. It is like everything has become the subject of polarization. And in that polarization, there's always the side that defends the absurd, that defends all that is against reason. So, sorry. I'm thinking, first of all, is it logically possible? Is it at all possible to reason with them? Because lately, what I think is that what we consider as a very practical, very almost ridiculous, fight on social media is a big philosophical question. Because there are these people, for instance, they say that the world is flat. How do I convince them? Okay, I show the photo of the planet and I say, look, it's round. And then they will say, oh, it's photoshopped. Okay, you know what? Like my friends, we all went to space and we saw that it was round. And he would say, no, you're lying. We know you're always lying. That's right-wing populist discourse as well. And then, you spend all your money, you buy a spaceship or rent a spaceship, and then you put this person on a spaceship and you bring him to the moon and you show the planet Earth and you say, look, it is round. And then he would say, well, I believe otherwise. So now this is a philosophical question, because now you have to prove that seeing or knowing is more valid than believing. Is it at all possible to discuss that? I don't think so. So do we have to reason with them becomes a philosophical question on one hand, but on the other hand, there is also a practical reality. Some of these guys are trying to kill me, like literally. So do I have to reason with them? Like in my country, that I have been receiving death threats, a few years ago. So do I have to reason? Shall I reason? Like, can I reason with them? I would love to reason with them, but there is a man who's trying to kill me. I mean, like, there's a limit, a practical life limit, sort of. And we are thinking about this question a lot, I think, about what to do with them. But I started thinking that we are not putting enough, equally, we're not, putting enough energy in the other question, which is, are we talking among each other? Like those who think that the world is round, are we having enough reasoning with each other that we are now, jumping to the other side? Because I don't think progressives, let's say in general, do not have enough togetherness today in order to create a political power to dominate the intellectual and political sphere so that everybody is convinced that the world is round, because truths are political subjects. You know, if everybody thinks that world is flat, world is flat. If you have enough political support, you can make the world round, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Well, talking about this philosophical question, because it has a philosophical aspect. Now, what is a fact? To what extent do we know facts by themselves or through interpretations? No, what is the relevance of interpretation of facts? And in fact, we are always interpreting facts. But you quote Zizek, the famous philosopher Zizek. And it's an interesting quote. In a very famous interview, he was asked, you remember, whether he would, if he were to vote in the American election, for whom would he vote? And he said Donald Trump, although he doesn't like Donald Trump, obviously. And why? Well, because there will be a big awakening, he said. New political movements will be set in motion. As opposed to Hillary Clinton, which meant the status quo. No? You argue that many left-wing intellectuals were condescendent with Erdogan's movement because it meant, if I follow you, a change of the status quo. So the derogatory aspect of the movement was for them promising. This derogatory aspect, of course, meant it was not necessary to imagine what would happen afterwards, because somehow they expected that after this derogatory phase, a new constructive phase would not be possible by someone like Erdogan, and probably they would overtake the country at that point somehow. Do I follow you here? Or?
Yeah. This, you know, the subject you're talking about is not only a political matter for me, but it's also a very emotional problem, because there were several of my friends who behaved like Zizek at the time. You know, when Erdogan was coming to power for the second time, and some of us were like really concerned. This would go horribly, which at the end happened. And some of them were like, Zizek, oh, we have to do this because this is how you shake the status quo. This is how you remove the strong hand of army from the administration. As you know, Turkey is still being run, if you ask me, with the military coup constitution 1980. We have a shared destiny with Chile in that sense. So there is an arrogance there, first of all, because they somehow behind their heads, I think, they feel like they are not going to be the object. They're not going to be the object of this oppression. You know, if they are behaving as if they're not citizens, but they are having this status beyond, like above citizenship, sort of. Any kind of oppression, whatever happens, it's okay because we're going to change its status quo. But that whatever happens, period, is really painful for normal people, for university students, for people who are writing, journalists, and so on. But these some intellectuals are behaving as if they are not. They are, they're having they're accommodating a space beyond or above citizenship. That is kind of emotional part for me. And fascism is such an interesting phenomenon, because you know who dropped the bombs at the end, or who killed who, who executed who, but you cannot really tell who actually in the first phase legitimized this political movement so that they became massive after a while. We cannot, we don't have that moral, crimes, so to speak. We don't have that category in our law systems. But actually, I think it's an intellectual crime to have supported a fascist regime in its first phase, because we are, these are not ordinary people. They are supposed to know better. They read Hannah Arendt, they read, all the literature on fascism, and they read Gramsci, they read this and that. So they should have known better. So this is an emotional problem for me as well, because I don't know how I will forgive them. I hope I will be as forgiving as Hannah Arendt. But then when that phase is over, when everybody is now certain that there is a fascist inclination in this political environment, it is mostly too late. Unfortunately, I came to see that fascism cannot be really defeated, or it is very, very, very difficult to defeat fascism within one nation. And with that nation's political resources. I don't know if I answered your question, but
yes, and it's quite. I mean, what you say is a serious thing. I mean, the fact that it's very hard to defeat fascism, because in a sense we're talking of that. I mean, it's a kind of new fascism, but these populist movements have a lot to do with fascism. And you're telling us that they're very, once they are in power, they're extremely difficult to defeat. Part of the power they have is the power they have over entrepreneurs. You explained that entrepreneurs gather around the populist autocrat. They expect to benefit from the state. You describe how, like in Hungary, the state makes deals with these loyal entrepreneurs which profit then from credit, subsidies, and other state benefits. Entrepreneurs realize, you're right, that the only way to win the giant public tenders and gain access to big bank loans was through personal approval for Mr. Erdogan. So what you get in the end is a kind of hodgepodge of state and private businesses, which breeds corruption and is very close to a kind of mafia state. Would you comment on that? How does this happen?
Well, I mean, like, first of all, when speaking of fascism, it is not like, oh, there's so much oppression, we should call it fascism. Some people think that I am using this word fascism because of that. No, I'm using fascism because of the relation between this political right-wing populist authoritarian power relation between that and the capital. I mean, like, capitalism is going through a very serious crisis, hopefully the last one. And the last time it happened, they called the brutal power of state for rescue. And this is, right-wing populist leaders is not really different than that. That's why I call it fascism. And I think it's time we call it fascism. There are people who think that this is only a historical concept, fascism, but it's also a political tool which seems to be being quite alive today. And within that context, of course, there is this capital almost, running towards the new power. And I'm thinking of Turkey. I'm like, this is how it happened. This is how it was economically and financially legitimized, this system, this leadership, this regime. But then the interesting part starts after a while, when this personal approval, the requirement of personal approval becomes a little bit shaky. Then they know that they have to, do everything for the personal approval. And somehow, at some point, they cannot. And that is why Turkey today is suffering from capital immigration. We are losing capital. The capitalists, the owner of the capital, is going away. They are in London, they're in New York, they're in Germany, they're leaving. because it's not only about money, it is also about humans as well. I mean, like all that capital cannot work without the brain power, and the brain drain has been happening due to political oppression since 2013. So yeah, mm, but that is important when it comes to the support for the leader, because when I watch CNN or BBC, or when these networks ask me questions about my country, they always say, but Erdogan has still almost half of the support of the half of the population. All right, he has, but it is not because of out of pure love, because this capital surrounding him is also creating a financial web that goes to the capillary systems of the country as well. So even the most ordinary man is being financially connected to the very top of the power. So that is why when there are elections in the ballot boxes, these people are fighting as if they're fighting for their lives for Erdogan to win. It is because they're fighting for their lives, literally. Because if Erdogan falls, this entire financial web will fall. Financial web that supplies political money to millions of people in Turkey. So in order to protect that web, they have to protect Erdogan. So that personal approval seems nice and easy in the beginning for especially big capital, and then they know that it's not very, very good.
So it's very impressive. So at the other side, you have poor people, which are in a sense bought by the social networks, the socioeconomic support that the government gives, and which is, you claim, closely linked to political decisions. For example, the number of people who are voting for the political party of Mr. Erdogan get the metro stations where others have to wait.
Well, especially in those countries where social justice is lacking from democracy, and where social rights are not in place, our social rights become the subject of charity, political charity of these parties. So that is why once this transformation is finished, social rights becoming the subject of charity, it is so easy after that. And in 2007, actually the opposition parties were fighting against this, because election time, Erdogan was giving everyone this food, things like support, and he was promising them more if they vote. So it was as if, like, there's no citizenship, there are supporters and the other ones that are completely superfluous. But if you want to have your social rights, you have to vote for me. So of course, I'm like, after 1980s, when citizens turned to clients, it was easy to do the second transformation, to turn them into subjects of political power. But this financial web is possible in those countries where there is less social justice, and where social rights have been turned into subjects of political charity.
So it becomes a weapon, also a political weapon in the hands of the autocrat. Now, let me make a kind of think a bit about Latin America, because for us in Latin America, perhaps the paradigm of populism is Perón, in Argentina. He governed Argentina from 1946 to 1955. And then again for a short period in 1973 to 1974. Now, Peronism is a great political force of Argentina today, and it has been so for decades. Now, the most famous interpretation of populism for us is the one given by the Argentinian intellectual Ernesto Laclau.
Yeah.
It's a neo-Marxist and positive vision of populism. You know? His view is very important to understand what Peronism is today, because he was a great figure who influenced a lot the government of Kirchner, and that is still the dominant line, let's say, within Peronism, because Peronism has different wings, no? But the dominant wing has been heavily influenced by Laclau's outlook. And according to Laclau, you have in a society a number of different, let's say, popular demands, and they have to be transformed into a movement of different social classes, but one movement. And he does not think the socialist revolution can be achieved only by the proletariat, let's say, or only by the peasants. In that sense, he breaks with Marx and Lenin or Mao and offers a new vision. No? A reunion of different social classes is required for the revolution to take place. And this is what populism achieves. This happens when? Well, this happens, he says, when one specific demand, I'm simplifying because his language is quite complicated, but basically what he says is one specific demand becomes the equivalent of all the other demands. And when this happens, you have a movement. For this to happen, and this is the crucial thing, for this to happen, the leader has to construct the enemy. And here is where Carl Schmitt comes in, because Carl Schmitt is an important influence on Laclau, although read from a neo-Marxist point of view. So it is the enemy what brings the movement together, because the new we of the movement is born dialectically, you know, from the guy who is not, or the guys who are not us, the others, the enemy. So the enemy makes us a unity and identity. Our identity, our collective identity, in a sense, is the result of having that common enemy. He writes, one has to construct the enemy through discourse, through language. The oligarchy, the establishment, the super rich, capitalism, globalization, and so forth, he says. And by the same reason, the identity of the people making demands is transformed in this process of universalization of their goals and of the enemy. So the moment you have the common enemy, you have the movement in a sense. Once this is achieved, the people may become a real revolutionary force. Only now will the people be a revolutionary agent. That's what he says. Now, does this outlook from Laclau is interesting to understand right-wing populism, which is your theme, or it's a totally different thing? Does it ring a bell somehow, this idea of constructing the enemy and organizing this movement in this way, or is it totally different situation?
My very dear friend Fawaz Trablusi, historian from Lebanon, from Beirut, when I started writing this book, he told me, you have to read Laclau, you have to read Laclau. And I've read Laclau, massively. I am very much in line with Laclau when it comes to this class matter, and I saw it happening with my own eyes, actually, in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. I was there in 2003 when when the economic crisis happened. I was with the Piquetero movement. I was reporting on them. So I saw it happening. When middle class is not there, it's not happening. I saw this fact. And I saw it happening in Turkey as well. You're right. If the middle class haven't had supported Erdogan, this could not have happened. But it was mostly the lower class and the upper class, I should say. Anyway, I think Laclau's vision yes, of course, it is very, very, effective in order to understand populism in terms of in the sense that we use in European sense, let's say, not in Peronist sense. But it is also very good to understand how we're going to change things, reverse the history, and do things better. Create better democracies. Actually, I am inspired by Laclau in terms of this constructing this one demand in different for different classes, and I think that concept should be dignity. That is the subject of the new book. But I am not really convinced with the construction of the other. And I'm inspired by feminist politics in this sense, because even though they are, women are the oppressed and so on, they do not construct their identity and their movement and their actions on the construction of the inferior other or evil other. So, the center will not hold, obviously, against this crisis of capitalism, against this morbid symptoms of the unborn new. But I think we are going to construct our demands around the word dignity, and this is how we're going to be. We're going to beat this new wave of fascism. I rather choose to believe in this. As those believe in world is flat, I believe in that we're going to do better against fascism.
Now, your book is not full of hope. and the, let's say, the attack of populism, well, you claim the attack are important. I mean, they are attacking representative democracy, the establishment, you say, and the state, these three things, and make them superfluous, or somehow make them feel superfluous, irrelevant. So it's a serious threat, and your own life is testimony of the seriousness of the threat. And as we've seen, you are not very confident that reason is able to really defeat the opponent. Political emotion seems to be on their side. It's different to find a different outlook. So your view is not optimistic. And you give in the book no recipe to defeat populism or to avoid populism. Nevertheless, somehow at the end, you express a kind of hope. And you say that you have hope in young women. And young women is your hope. Why? Why are they not subject to the...
Well, women are, it is not coincidence that women are the first responders to fascism, because they develop these, very sensitive antennas since centuries to oppression. So they are responding first. And the reason we are living all this violence, rise in violence against women, is that I think radical male, who has been a great company to fascism all this time, is now attacking women. And this is the first front. If they bring down women and, the progressive women, they're going to continue uniforming the humanity. So I trust in young women more than actually women my age, I would say, because thanks to feminist politics, they are not embarrassed of being powerful, and they're not afraid of being alone. Our generation was quite afraid of these two things. So in their fight, there are less things to hold them back. And I do think that 21st century will be female, and I use female as a wide spectrum, like starting from women, including half of the men, from this half of the men. So I think young women will create this female century. And it's not going to be like, only a better capitalism or better democracy. But I think we are going to go through a moral transformation as well. We're going to discuss what power is really massively. We're going to discuss what our values are and so on. I think this big crisis of capitalism will, and thanks to pandemic, we have seen the preview of that. We're going to witness some big, massive, intense transformation politically and morally. And I think young women will be the pioneers, will be the flagships of that transformation.
Ece Tebulkuran, thank you very, very much for this wonderful conversation. It's been fascinating to listening to you. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Arturo. Hoping to see you face to face in Chile, hopefully.
I hope so. Take care. Thank you very, very much.
You too. Bye.
Thank you for your audience. I thank the audience for sharing with us these moments. The book is extremely interesting, published by Anagrama, Como Perder un País. Recomiendo el país, el libro sin vacilaciones. Muchas gracias y muy buenas noches. Hasta luego.